Is gender identity fixed, or can it change during a person's lifetime? So gender according to the dictionary relates to social and cultural differences between the two biological sexes, being male and female. So male and female sexes, you're born with the male genitalia or the female genitalia, and the gender is the social and cultural differences around those sexes. And gender identity is how you perceive or identify or have an affinity for those different identities. So transgender identity, according to the dictionary, relates to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with their birth or biological sex. Now, for the purpose of this recording, I'm not talking about intersex people, because those are people with biological characteristics of both biological sexes. I'm not talking about those. I'm not discarding them, but that's not the topic of this conversation. This conversation is to do with, is transgender identity fixed? And so, as well as male and female, there's also non-binary gender identity, which is, according to my daughter, who identifies as this, she does not feel either male or female and feels more genderless, androgynous, and there are other definitions as well, other variations. So this recording is for parents whose teenagers have suddenly identified themselves as transgender. They do not, that the parent, it doesn't sit well with the parents, not because they are transphobic, but because they've never seen any hint of this gender concern or gender identity issue or transgender identity in the past with these teenagers. So the question is, once your teen says, I am transgender, is that a fixed identity or can it change? Someone asked me recently, well, is transgender even a real thing? Of course it's a real thing. There are people who call themselves transgender and identify as transgender. They identify more with the gender characteristics of the opposite biological sex than their own. So it is a real thing. There is no doubt that some people identify as transgender for a lifelong journey in life, or they start at a certain point and continue to the rest of their life. There's no doubt about that. There is also no doubt that some people who identify as transgender later identify as something else. There are many people who identify as transgender and then they do what is called desist or detransition. So desist would be if they've just done a social transition and they no longer follow that social transition. So social transition could be to do with changing their hairstyles and their clothes, more relating to the other gender, and then they change back again. They may have changed their name, they may have changed their pronouns, and then detransition is where somebody has transitioned medically with hormones and or surgery to more approximate the look of the other biological sex. And then when they detransition, they move away from that. They will stop taking hormones, cross-sex hormones, and they may have surgery to reverse the procedures they've had done before, or they may not surgically alter themselves, but they consider themselves to be the gender that matches their biological sex. So if they were born female, they transitioned, they identified as a transgender man, they changed or they underwent a transition to more fit in with the masculinity. They had hormones, perhaps had their breasts removed in the hopes of becoming more like a man. And then detransition is trying to reverse that process, although some of the transition process is irreversible. So to answer the question that a lot of parents of teenagers who So to answer the question of parents whose children or teenagers suddenly out of the blue declare that they are transgender, or boys who suddenly say, I actually am a girl, or girls who say, I actually am a boy. The question that those parents have is that new gender identity fixed, or can it change? Absolutely, it is not fixed for everybody. Some will stay with the new identity and some will change. And we know this because so many people desist or detransition. So there's no scientific evidence, or it just defies common sense and logic to say that once you identify as transgender, that is the end of the identity journey and that nothing would ever change. For some people, they do change identities to something else, and for some, they continue in that identity. Lisa Marciano has a very good blog, and I'll put the link down below, relating to teenagers who desist from a transgender identity and the common characteristics that she's seen in her practice over many examples of what is more likely to lead teenagers to desist from a transgender identity. And these things include never being fully affirmed by responsible adults in their life, such as teachers or parents or therapists. Other characteristics include teenagers that are mentally healthy. Otherwise, if they have poor mental health, they're less likely to desist. And I really recommend that blog to you. Now, let me be clear that when a teenager identifies as transgender, they 100% absolutely do identify as transgender. It's not an opportunity to try and persuade them that they're not transgender. It is not, that could be seen as very disrespectful. At that time, that is their identity. That is their personal reality. So what we did with our daughter is that we did not try to convince her she wasn't transgender. We did say to her, look, this doesn't gel with our personal experience of you over these last 13 years. Keep your ideas open, keep your mind open, keep your heart open. Don't close off any future ideas or identities. Don't become fixated. Don't copy what you see people doing online. Don't do what your therapist tells you. Don't do what the teachers tell you. Don't do what your friends tell you. And don't even do what your parents tell you. This is your journey, and it is a journey of discovery. And if you consider that you are transgender and you continue in that identity, that is one of the options. One of the other options is that this may not be something that lasts forever. And my daughter identified as transgender for 9 months. She was transgender. And after those 9 months, she has subsequently identified as non-binary, which is the not really feeling male or female, more of an androgynous identity. So I can't say that she was not transgender. She's currently not transgender, but when she identified as transgender, she was transgender. And when she was transgender, we did not agree to anything that would be physically harmful for her or that would entrench her in that gender identity. So we allowed things like haircuts and masculine clothes. We did not allow things like hormones, surgery, binders, things that would give her physical negative consequences. And we also did not allow affirmation, especially name change, pronoun change, although we went through a process with that. And we did allow her to experiment with different names in small groups. And if you want to know more about names and pronouns, I've got a video on my YouTube channel relating especially to names and pronouns. So as a parent of a teen who suddenly identifies as transgender, the answer is some of them change their identity. They change their mind. It's a, I don't want to say phase, it is an identity that lasts for a finite amount of time for some people. And for me, locking them into that identity by use of hormones and surgery would be irresponsible. And in our daughter's case, she was very clearly identifying as transgender and then had the freedom to change. And she actually one time said, "I'm so glad that you didn't allow me to use my boy's name at school." She said, because that would have locked in and limited my future options, would have locked me into that transgender identity and made it more difficult for me to change how I present to the world when my ideas about myself changed. And I guess she matured. She didn't use that word, but that's what I suspect has happened. And has she finished changing and maturing and growing? No, absolutely not. We certainly, adults' brains aren't even fully developed until they're 25. So as you develop as a person, for some people, part of that journey is a gender identity journey. All the very best with your teenager and their gender identity journey. I'm wishing you lots of love and luck, and